Hi, I am Tim Cook, and this is video 2 of the training on business planning in West African marine protected areas, organized by the Réseau des aires marines protégées d'Afrique de l'Ouest and delivered by Baastel Consulting Group and BlueSeeds. In the previous video, we explored the need to address threats to marine biodiversity and how MPAs are an important tool for marine conservation. Here, I will explain why MPAs need to deliver strong protection and how money is essential to do this. So we've seen that we need protected areas, but just how much protection do we need? Well, the Convention on Biological Diversity of 2010 in Aichi, Japan, produced a strategic plan for the year 2020, and the target 11 of this plan states that we need at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, to be conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures, and these need to be integrated into the wider landscapes or seascapes. So where do we stand today? Today we are not far from the mark on terrestrial protected areas, but still far from the 10% in the marine environment. So what is the situation in West Africa? A 2017-18 survey of MPAs of the RAMPAO network provides the most accurate published map of MPA distribution in West Africa. The map shows the location of 88 MPAs located across 7 countries, from Mauritania in the north to Sierra Leone in the south, including Cabo Verde, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea. The resulting coverage of MPAs in the region accounts for approximately 1% of the total economic exclusive zone of those countries. Thus, the West African region must increase its coverage substantially in order to reach the Aichi Target 11 of a 10% coverage of its marine sector. This map shows the hypothetical MPAs that would need to be created to reach that objective, by adding offshore areas in particular covering marine pits like here, or seamount environments like here. It is worth mentioning that international negotiations for post-2020 global biodiversity framework are pushing for a 30% global coverage by MPAs of marine waters. This means that even more effort will have to be made in the coming years by West African countries to implement international objectives. However, coverage in itself, the proportion of surface area which is protected, is not sufficient. What is also important is how well managed that protected area is. So to be effective, a protected area must deliver actual protection. In this example here of a study of 124 fully protected MPAs, the authors studied a different variety of parameters and noticed that fish biomass, fish density, fish size, and species richness inside the no-take zones of the MPA increased in substantial proportions, demonstrating that full protection increases key ecological variables. Okay, so we've seen that the efficiency with which protected areas preserve biodiversity and ecosystem services depends on the level of protection of these protected areas. However, efficient management necessitates resources, and today only 22% of protected areas report adequate resources in terms of both staffing and budgets, which represents about 25% of the surface area of protected areas globally. So how does this lack of resource translate into marine protected area efficiency? Well, there's a strong relationship between staff and budget capacity and MPA effectiveness. As you can see on this figure, the biomass response, the increase in biomass inside a marine protected area is much stronger when there is adequate staff compared to when there is inadequate staff capacity. So how do you summarize this? If you consider MPAs globally, irrespective of their status, their level of protection, 71% of MPAs have positive impacts, with fish biomass levels 1.6 times higher on average than in non-MPA areas. But as we've seen, the ecological performance of the MPA depends on staff and budget. So staff and budget capacity are the two strongest management predictors for differences in fish biomass. For example, MPAs with sufficient staff and an adequate budget had nearly 3 times a greater fish biomass than MPAs with inadequate budget and staff. Unfortunately, only 9% of MPAs have sufficient staff capacity, and only 35% of MPAs have an adequate budget. This lack of adequate resources for effective management of protected areas is called the financing gap. Now, in a recent report, the financing gap of global biodiversity conservation was estimated to be at least $700 billion a year. So this represents the difference between what is funded today annually for global biodiversity conservation and what needs to be spent yearly to reach the conservation objectives by 2030. Now, this may seem like a lot of money, but it is interesting to bear in mind that we could close the nature funding gap for the cost of what the world spends currently on cigarettes or soft drinks. And expressed in a different manner, we could close the nature financing gap for less than 1% of the annual gross global product. Estimates for the ocean globally suggest that approximately 175 billion US dollars per year are needed to reach the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 14, while the current levels of funding for this represent only 52 billion US dollars per year. In West Africa, the financing gap of marine conservation is unknown, but financing of MPAs is a recurrent problem, and funding from international organizations or private foundations is usually a solution. Because of this lack of funding, reaching conservation objectives for MPAs is a challenge in this region that will become even greater if West African countries increase their MPA numbers and surface areas to meet the 2020 Aichi targets of a 10% marine coverage, target that might increase to 30% for the year 2030. Thank you very much for your attention. We've seen that proper funding is key to MPA effectiveness. However, we've also seen that MPAs are underfunded, and this is called the financing gap. In the next video, we will discuss how to calculate this financing gap for your MPA. See you soon.